right, let's get started. So we have 25 minutes, roughly 30 minutes maybe for the presentation, and depending on the time, 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. All right, let's get started.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giordancho, for this wonderful occasion. And thank you very much for Professor Schmitz for the stimulating opening keynote speech. I found it very interesting the relationship between the knowledge and the unknown, but I did not dare to pose a question, and because I was not sure quite a lot, but I hope these questions will become cleared up as this conference goes on. And also, I'd like to thank Professor the Roko Gangu for your tutorial last night. It helped me a lot to get a clearer understanding of the general direction François Laruelle's thinking has been coming along. And when I was asked by Giordancho to give a talk about in relation to François Laruelle, I wasn't sure, you know. I find the very philosophical sort of arguments in non-philosophy very hard, and I was not sure if I can make a good sort of contribution. But when I read general theory of victims, I felt that there are very clear sort of affinities, not only with some of the so-called engaged thinkers in Japan, but also to my own personal interests. So I decided to try to talk about this possible point of encounter between Laruelle and Japanese thinking. And as Professor Gangu explained last night, especially I understand that this last stage of Laruelle's thought is a sort of a wager, or a pari en français, or kake in Japanese. So please take my talk today also as a wager, a pari attempt to find a point of encountering. So, so I try to seek a dialogue between the two. And at first, I thought of introducing some significant thinkers, including Miki Kiyoshi, one of the Nishida's students, and also some other thinkers not belonging to the Kyoto School, such as the Tsurumi Shunsuke and Ishimure Michiko. But I came to realize it would be impossible in terms of time. So I decided to concentrate only on Miki Kiyoshi today. So I'd like to go this way. At first, I try to confirm the most important points in general theory of victims. And then I'd like to go on to the Miki Kiyoshi and give a very short sort of a summary presentation of his thinking on pathos, pathos, and makoto. Makoto is a Japanese word meaning moral truth. And so I think that I can sort of present a very promising sort of a field of convergence between Laruelle and Miki Kiyoshi at least. And lastly, I'd like to present some tentative questions regarding this encounter between the two. So let me confirm the basic sort of central points Laruelle presents in his introduction to this recent book, French original published 2012 and English translation 5 years ago. So at the very beginning, he states as follows. So he's going to question the relationship between the intellectuals and philosophical intellectuals and the notion of victim. So it reads, if a theory of victims does not yet exist explicitly as such in philosophy, it is because philosophy is more interested in force, power, and domination, primarily its own. And okay. The victim is now a blurred, ambiguous generality, an object of indiscriminate use, forgotten by conceptual thought. It is now overexploited by images and information in the doxa of we are all victims. So you can see he's trying to pose a new way to pose philosophical question from the viewpoint of a victim. And so there are lots of sort of an overflow of images and talks in the media about victims in our age, but Laruelle asserts there is no adequate philosophical conceptual thinking regarding victim. So he says, our goal is different, to relocate the victim, if possible, from the phase of being an intellectual and media object to status of an object of knowledge, from its image to its concept. So this essay formalizes the relationship of intellectuals to victims as regards their final touchstone or last honor. So in other words, intellectuals, philosophies, relationship with victims should be the final touchstone for intellectual thinking. And in red part, it is above all a question of those contemporary intellectuals who in general have lost their Marxist points of reference and shamelessly surrendered to liberalism. So you can see this question of victim is related to the course of Marxist thought in the 20th centuries. And I think when we think of the Kyoto School sort of thought, Marxist thought has a very crucial, pivotal sort of a point, in the sense that, let me introduce, Japanese scholars and students all know this very well-known tanka, short poem by Nishida. 夜更けまでまたマルクスを論じたり、マルクスゆえに苦手にする。So it can be translated as far into the night, discussing Marx again. Because of Marx, difficult to fall asleep again. So 1929. So that means around this time, lots of his students went to Nishida's house to discuss all sorts of philosophical topics. But around this time, question of Marxism or Marxist philosophy of history was at the center of their concerns. So, and there are actually the so-called left-wing thinkers in the Kyoto School, and including Miki Kiyoshi and Tosaka Jun and Nakai Masakazu. And particularly for Tosaka Jun posed a very, very straightforward critique of Nishida's notion of nothingness, actually. So in this sense, Marxist thinkers of the Kyoto School has a very clear particular relevance for our interest in the encounter between Laruelle and the Kyoto School. And so this is another point. So in order to see what is at the center of Professor Laruelle's sort of questioning of the notion of victim, he writes, we attempt to pose the most difficult problem, that of the reason for persecution and extermination. Why do we kill? And it is a question of founding ethics on the unlocalizable and sometimes unidentifiable victim. And this would follow a movement of thought begun, for example, by Levinas' humanism of the other, d'humanisme de l'autre homme, and would better agree with our experience of the past century and draw out its consequences. So it is clear that at the center is what we all know as what happened during the World War II, particularly in Nazi Germany. So, and regarding this sort of a passage, what came up in my mind is Miki Kiyoshi's sort of thinking in terms of today's humanism. He used humanism during the wartime, but he tried to sort of transform the notion of humanism on the basis of the Nishida philosophy, and also in order to deal with the contemporary problems, including technology, science, and environment. And there's a very interesting notion or sort of a writing by Miki Kiyoshi, where he discusses moral truth as responding to calls from others, which sounds very much like a phrase coming from Levinas, but this is, I'm going to discuss more later. But I think in terms of time, let me skip a little bit. And another very clear point of convergence with the not only Kyoto School, but also the Asian Buddhist tradition. Professor Laruelle writes, a certain theoretical practice is capable of itself being compassion. Philosophy scarcely shows. The highest thought, both of its proud virtues, while mocking weak passions. For example, Spinoza, sadness, Hegel, the beautiful soul, Nietzsche, pity. against philosophy's sufficiency, presented by thinkers like Spinoza and Hegel, Nietzsche. We introduce into philosophy a principle of compassion, which will substitute itself for pity and likewise for vengeance and heroism. As we all know, compassion is actually at the very bottom and at the core of the Buddhist thinking, all through the histories, and dukkha, suffering, and compassion. And in Nishida's case, this is also everybody interested in Nishida knows this point. This is one of the most well-known phrase by Nishida. Nishida wrote, "Motivation for philosophy must be not wonder, just like in Western philosophy, but motivation for philosophy must be the deep sorrow of life." So there can be, there are lots of philosophical works, articles written on this topic, but we cannot go into detail. But and yeah, the last point, the victims ought to be ethically assisted by non-philosophical rather than ontological thought. The first task is paradoxical, thinking humanity as indivisible by cultures, communities, and races, while at the same time as not being a transcendent unity like essence or nature. I think this is a very relatively more concrete way to develop the notion of the humanity. And yeah, the second half. So the notion of generic notion of victim in person and what is meant is very important. And it is not a particular or individual victim, but the state of humans insofar as they are capable as such of being persecuted, victimizable, de jure, but not always explicitly victimized, but is immediately capable of being or of becoming victim. The victim is the most exposed depth of humans. Their capacity to be defeated on occasions that also revive their capacity as a weak force of resistance. I think this is really expresses the core of Professor Laruelle's thinking on victim as a generic understanding of victim. I think I do understand what is being tried by under the name of the generic notion of victim in person. But I'd like to pose a tentative question about this point. And the time passes so quickly, but I cannot skip this one in relation to Miki. So this is Professor Laruelle's. The victim feels itself as a victim rather than nothing, because it is always in correlation with the world, but must actualize it in an understanding and principle compassion, which runs between victims and which intellectuals in the broad sense must assume. and the victim also of not yet knowing who and what its executioner is. So at the initial sort of a state of being becoming a victim, I think victim, it is possible that victim does not know who and what his executioner is. So radical passivity is that which cannot react with an excess of power or an overpower. It is impossible for it to react as a reflex, but it is capable of acting totally otherwise by the depotentialization of philosophical overpower. Only the victim is capable of safeguarding its human dignity in all cases. The victim has a final resource to do this. I'm not sure about I cannot say I am understanding clearly these sort of lines, but I think I understand. I can understand what is at stake, and this part sort of reminded me of Miki Kiyoshi's thinking on dialectical pathos and logos, and or what he called uh, basic experience and self-understanding. As we can see later, we can see a apparently similar sort of attempt to think about our most basic experience in Miki Kiyoshi too. And this is a very rough chronology of Miki's life. As you can see, as is quite well known, going to Germany as a young student, studying with Heidegger and Levitt, and coming back, he published books like 1926, Study of Human Being in Pascal, and so the 27 Marxist form of anthropology. I think this is very important for our interest tonight, and also philosophy of history, and 38 philosophy of technology, and 39 is the most important collection of his writing, A Logic of Creative Imagination, and Introduction to Philosophy. So these are all published during the wartime, just before the Pacific War started. And he was conscripted for work in the Philippines by the armies. And so this experience in the Philippines had a very decisive sort of influences on philosophical thinking. And I have to really go quickly. So I wanted to introduce some of the Miki Kiyoshi's central thinking in relation to Laruelle, and I picked up 2 points: pathos and responding to calls from others. In the Kyoto School, as a community of mutually critical inquirers, Miki Kiyoshi occupies an axial place alongside Tanabe Hajime and Tosaka Jun. And according to Japanese scholar Uchida, Miki Kiyoshi was first of all a philosopher who endeavored to provide philosophy with genjutsu, reality, actuality, and to construct philosophy as a directive to criticize and reform the reality of life. So, secondly, Miki set philosophy of history at his thinking, at the center of his thinking. It was a philosophy of history that aims to create society through causation, unique individuals using their kosoryoku, creative formative imagination. And that what he called dialectics of logos and pathos. Later on, Miki himself came to realize these sort of dialectical, sort of schematic thinking arguments is too schematic, abstract yet. But anyway, we can see the center of his sort of questioning. A mode of thinking to be should be developed on the basis of the bodily jukusei, pain susceptibility, pathos of human beings. In order to liberate oneself from one's mind-body's jukusei, pathos, it is necessary first to look into pathos, these passive suffering experience transparently. But in order to become liberated from the sources of juku, sufferings, passions, it will not be sufficient just to look at them. We need the second logos, that is, the ability to transcend the limit of the established reality, meta logos, to form a new image of a life world in its place. This might have something to do with what Professor Gangu explained last night, but I'm not sure about it. And so in summary, first, the logos consciousness that comes into being, transcending the pathos consciousness in which it is rooted. Also, as a result, a mode wherein the pathos consciousness and the logos consciousness are internally united. Therefore, the deepest human capacity of meta-logos that appears with such double aspect. I hope this gives you a very rough sort of image, at least, of Miki's sort of central questioning. And but I suppose you also feel that, as I said, is rather very schematic sort of handling of the question. So isn't the conflict between pathos and logos treated in such a way as to be transcended in a quasi-pre-established harmony by the mere logical mediation that Miki wanted to avoid most himself? But there's a very interesting, another possibility here, responding to calls from others. However, we often encounter highly intriguing crystalline expression of Miki's meditation on rift gaps with others. For example, in the chapter on the problems regarding action, he writes, moral truth is historical truth, and it occurs between a subject and a subject. It is what occurs between a human being and human being, hito to hito no aida. Therefore, it can be the case that it does not occur, and then falsity instead of truth appears. What is human truth, hito no makoto? It means I become awakened from thou and respond to thou's calls. My truth, makoto, in Japanese, can be expressed in Chinese characters in more than one way. Makoto can be true sort of events or true words or even integrity, sincerity. So my truth, makoto, becomes disclosed in such responding, and truth occurs, that is, its truth is historical. Calls are always concrete, and acts to respond to such calls are always concrete. Let me go to the, this is a additional sort of point, I think, in his experience in the Philippines. And let me go to the concluding slide. And so reading the Professor Laruelle's Journal Theory of Victims, I was very sort of intrigued and stimulated and into thinking about, for one thing, Miki Kiyoshi's ideas and the concrete sort of problems I have encountered while I have been involved in the anti-nuclear sort of activities. I'm living in Hiroshima, and so I've been involved in the very concrete sort of anti-nuclear activities, campaigns. So you can see this question of victims has been a very close one to me. So this is a very tentative questions that came up spontaneously in my mind. Some of them may be very off the point, but I'd like to present tonight as a wager attempt. For example, how about the relationship between the generic notion of victim and the concrete actual cases of victims? Related question, generic relation. How about what is the relationship between generic notion and the so-called family resemblances of notions? And these can be, I think, not contradictory with each other, can be complementary. But I tend to think that to try to understand the problems of victims in terms of family resemblances, at least at first, would make a really lot of help. And third, related, legal political difficulties regarding recognition of victims as victims in certain cases, such as those involving radiation victims. You know, in the case of the A-bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the instantaneous victims are very clear, but there has been an invisible internal radiation influences. And in those cases, the legally, politically, it's been really difficult and controversial till today. So whether or not we can recognize victims as victims can be very, very difficult. And also related for ambiguity of victim perpetrator distinction in certain cases. For example, think of the wartime Japan and the Minamata pollution. Actually, some of the victims in Minamata industrial pollution, some of them suffered a lot, but came to think that they cannot consider themselves only as victims, maybe they were involved in causing the pollution themselves. So this kind of very complicated relationship. And fifth, related possible tension between life as a victim and life as a person. I'm not sure about this one, but this may be put in tension in the relation between victim in person and man in person. For example, think of a Japanese writer, Ishimure Michiko's work, Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow. And actually, this can be very misleading, but I think even in the life of victims, Ishimura Michiko recognizes the so-called self-enjoyment of life. So let me pose this one just as sort of a tentative question. And the sixth, intellectuals as victims. And in the case of the Marxist thinkers in Japan too, lots of Marxist intellectuals were forced to give up their Marxist thinking and convert. And so intellectuals are, of course, can be victims quite often. And lastly, isn't there a need to bring into view the aggressor's perpetrator side in order to think fully about the situation, and also the so-called structured violence? And for example, I find the general theory of victims very, very stimulating, but on the other hand, as a Japanese, I feel quite uncomfortable, uncomfortable because Japan as a country basically was on the side of the aggressors and the perpetrators. So what's the significance for us Japanese intellectuals to think about the victim, the genetic notion of victims? So I think this was something came up in my mind in a very natural way. And as I said, I'm not sure if these questions are very relevant to Professor Laruelle's sort of meditation on the genetic notion of victim. But this is what I can present as my response today. Thank you very much for your listening.
I would like to thank Professor Kazashi for this stimulating talk. Actually, Professor Kazashi is probably the first researcher to do a comparison between Laruelle, Kiyoshi, Ishimure, and Tsurumi. So there's a lot of venues here that are opening up, and I wish we had more time. And actually, we used up the entire time allocated for Q&A and presentation. So we were supposed to go now with about 15 minutes 15-minute break. So what I would propose is for anyone who wants to take a break to be here, come back roughly 5 minutes before 9 or whatever the clock displays and wherever you are in the world, but Tokyo time, now it's 8:40, 41, so 8:55. And those who want to ask questions, if Professor Kazashi is not too tired, I would like to invite you all to stay and use the break maybe to have a chat with Professor Kazashi on the topics presented. So I will just remove myself temporarily because I'm the next presenter and I would like to have like 10 minutes break, and I will let Professor Gango take over if that's okay, if he's not too tired, and just fill in for me for just a few minutes. I'll be back real soon.
Sure. Yes, thank you, Professor Kazashi, for the talk. Yes, let's go ahead and open it for questions. I'm not sure if anything had shown up in the chat. It doesn't look like it. So if you have a question, if you can push the in the reactions down at the toolbar on the bottom of the screen, there should be a raise your hand button. And if you click that, then it will alert everyone. If there isn't an initial question, I would be interested in posing to you the question of Miki's resistance to the easy solution of a kind of logical mediation. It seems like one of the problems he wants to address is to overcome what philosophy might present as the kind of simple solution through the concept, and what he is aiming at would be something like a concrete mediation. And I was wondering, would you be able to say more about what is ultimately is that difference, if that difference is not the same as the traditional difference between, say, concept and reality?
Thank you very much for the question. Very important, not only for Miki Kiyoshi, but actually it concerns the part I had to skip about his experience in the Philippines, particularly. And as you may know, Miki Kiyoshi had to die in prison just after the end of the World War II. And he was quite young yet. So if he could go on living after the war, it would have been very interesting because he would have tried to develop in the line you mentioned, suggested. And actually, I can share my slides later through the chat, but you can see that actually he spent just about 10 months in the Philippines as a very intellectual publicity staff for the Japanese army in the Philippines. So he came to sort of he came face to face with the reality of the war quite for the first time in the Philippines, trying to communicate with the people in the Philippines. And so, in a word, I coded this in my slide, so you can have a look at it later. But Miki Kiyoshi actually came to confess after coming back from the Philippines that all the abstract philosophical sort of a dialectical talk is nothing but a very idealist and sort of rhetoric separated from the reality and from what's going on during the wartime, especially. So he came to realize this. We can say this is a very, very simple reality, but he came to realize the difference between the philosophical thinking in terms of the, for example, dialectic of the pathos and logos, and what's going on in the real world. So, and I think he came to face the clear limit of abstract philosophical thinking, including his own. So actually what he was absorbed in during his stay in the Philippines was research, very economic research about the Philippines. For example, leaving aside the so-called philosophy. And so he was really concentrated on other disciplines, economics, sociology, and anthropology, and ethnic studies too. So I think this was a direction Miki Kiyoshi was heading. And too bad, we are very sorry that, so, and some of the scholars say that post-war Japan started with the death of Miki Kiyoshi. And so we are left with his questions. And so let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. It looks like there's a question from Casey Orendane.
Yes, you said that correctly. Thank you, Professor Gango. I'm Casey Orendine from the University of the Philippines. So thank you, Kazashi Sensei, for that wonderful talk. And since you know me, you know that I find this topic very fascinating. Actually, I wanted to ask if it's correct to say that there is a pathology in our conception of subjectivity if we view people as victims or ourselves as victims. And in relation to this, what would Miki Kiyoshi and Laruelle say about this? Can they say anything about this? And maybe also, aside from Kazashi Sensei, maybe also Professor and François can say something about this also, since they it's related to what Laruelle and Miki Kiyoshi can say about victimhood. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I cannot say, of course, on behalf of Professor Laruelle. But I think your question can be related to one of my tentative questions. I think I think I can understand what is in question in terms of the generic notion of victims, but as I mentioned, when we think of the cases related to, for example, radioactive contaminations, for example, I think I'm not sure about a possible relationship. What can make of this possible relationship between the generic notion of the victims and the concrete problems we are facing? And also, I think this is another sort of direction I became interested in. As I listed in my reference, I think one of the recent works by Professor Laruelle, I understand, is about ecology. So I think when we when we try to think both the victim question and the ecology question, I think we sort of we would need to come up with something else other than the generic notion of victims. And so I think just as a local Professor Gangu said, I'd like to repeat, this is a very challenging sort of attempt, wager for us all, and the ecological problem situation. Nobody knows what we can do with it. So in that sense, this is a wager, and so I think naturally we have to try every possible way to tackle this global question of ecological crisis, which has been producing victims because of the climate change, I think. So, and what I can say, as I said, I cannot represent Professor Laruelle. So this is my personal reaction. So I think what I can say most is that this is actually the direction we are really being forced to go to, I think. Yeah. So thank you very much, Casey. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to see the conversation is still ongoing, and it's almost an hour. Kazashi Sensei, would you like to keep taking other questions, or would you like to?
Maybe we can go back tomorrow, right? We can come back tomorrow to this question. Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I had to spend more time than I planned, but I'd like to thank you.